Hello and welcome to my mycelium growth experiment video where I will show you how I cultivated and processed a disc of mycelium leather. So for the materials I used some ethanol, blue roll, a glass jar and a metal lid with a hole in it, some micropore tape, some tin foil, a 1 litre measuring jug, some malt extract and some yeast extract, safety gloves, a mycelium agar dish, a scalpel, a lighter, a face mask, some parafilm, some baking paper, a pressure cooker, sterile box, and lastly an incubator. So now for the method. First I sterilised the glass jar, then measured out 150 millilitres of distilled water and poured it into the jar. Then I measured out 4 grams of malt extract and 2 grams of yeast extract. Poured those into the jar and gave it a stir. Then I applied 2 layers of micropore tape over the hole on both sides of the metal lid. Then I put the lid on the jar and covered it with some tin foil so that the tape doesn't get wet during sterilisation. So now I'm just preparing the pressure cooker. I'm just gonna pop the glass jar in with a small amount of water. Then I'm just setting it to pressurise for an hour and then I'll come back when it's done. So after an hour I took the jar out to cool, and to speed up this process I placed it in a water bath. Now we're going to start working in the sterile box. So I initially sterilised it with some ethanol, and now I'm just placing all of the equipment needed inside. So we've got the glass jar in there already, then we've got the scalpel, a lighter, some tin foil, a strip of parafilm, and lastly the mycelium agar plate. So I started off by removing the jar from the lid, then sterilising the scalpel with the lighter. Then I cut a small piece of the mycelium on agar and just popped it in to the glass jar. Then I placed the lid back onto the jar and covered it up with some tin foil. Then I'm just going to seal the mycelium plate with the parafilm. And then we are ready to leave it in the incubator. There it is. So I left it for 30 days at approximately 27 degrees Celsius. Now we are back in the sterile box to harvest the mycelium disc. So when I remove the lid, we can see that there is a lot of aerial mycelium growth. And using a scalpel, I'm just unsticking the mycelium from the sides of the jar. And then removing the disc. So here is the disc after a quick pat dry with some blue roll. It is quite thin, but it has a lovely texture on the back and it is very pure on the front. I also collected some of the aerial growth, which, as you can see here, is extremely light and fluffy. So I also harvested one of my other jars, which had limited mycelium growth over the same period of time, but I thought I'd process it as well and see what happens. To process the disc into the leather material, I'm first putting it between 2 sheets of baking paper and then gently pressing it. So here is the disc after being heat pressed. Unfortunately, it does have a little tear on the edge. I also pressed the limited growth disc. This turned out really brittle after the heat press. And lastly, I pressed the bits of aerial growth together into this little shape. To create a glycerol bath, I measured out 100 millilitres of glycerol and then poured it into 300 ml of distilled water. Then I just popped the mycelium pieces into the bath and then left them overnight just to plasticize the material. So the next day I removed the mycelium pieces from the bath and then pat them dry with some blue roll. Here you can see the mycelium material has become quite weak with some extra tears in the middle and the edge. I put the pieces in the dehydrator at a low heat, and after about 10 minutes I took them out. Here is the dried mycelium disc. The limited growth piece is still quite brittle after being dried. And then lastly, here is my weird little aerial growth shape after being dried. So for a coating, I'm using organic beeswax, and I melted a small amount of this in a glass jar using a bain-marie. Then using a paintbrush, I applied the beeswax coating to both sides of the mycelium disc, as well as the limited growth piece. So after one final heat press, here are the final results. The mycelium disc turned out pretty thin, but still flexible and malleable with the beeswax coating. The limited growth piece became a lot more flexible after the coating and the final heat press. And finally, the aerial growth shape had quite a good thickness, but there was just not enough of it to make a full disc of mycelium material. So here are some of the other growths from this experiment. This was my first successful cultivation. As you can see, when I removed the disc, it was pretty thin. So unfortunately, when processed, it became so weak that it tore, as you can see in this photo. This was my second successful cultivation. I left it for a lot longer, around 10 weeks of growth, and the resulting disc was extremely thick. But sadly, I must be a very unlucky person because it disintegrated in the heat press. And lastly, I wanted to pay a quick homage to some of the failed experiments. Quite a lot of contamination.